All right, let's put the women and children to bed and go looking for dinner. Jon Rothstein here on Inside College Basketball Now. Want to remind you to subscribe to Inside College Basketball Now on both Apple and Spotify. We want to be your Bible for the college basketball season and beyond. We are the only college basketball podcast coming to you 52 weeks out of the calendar year. Also, want you to make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and send me your questions in the chat. I will get to them later in the show. Once again, this show is dedicated to serving you, the college basketball fan, 52 weeks out of the calendar year. And we are now 2 weeks away, 14 days to be exact, from opening night of the 25-26 college basketball season. Obviously, the marquee doubleheader that night will be in Las Vegas. Arizona taking on Florida, BYU taking on Villanova, and there's still a couple of more big things to get to between now and opening night, a couple more big-time exhibitions, and we'll get to some of the exhibitions later in this show and what they mean and what my biggest takeaways are. But first, as always, let's start with three big things, and the first thing I want to get to right now comes off my visit from Gainesville, where I saw Florida last week, and it's that Florida's front court has made major strides. Now, the backbone of last year's run to the national championship for Florida was obviously the perimeter. Walter Clayton Jr., Elijah Martin, Will Richard, and Denzel Aberdeen, who transferred to Kentucky. But last week, after spending time in Gainesville, I think unequivocally, you have to love what Florida has done in the front court in terms of their offseason development. Florida's staff firmly believes that it has 4 starters in the front court, even though 4 players will probably not start. Tommy Hauck is going to slide down and be the 3-man for Todd Golden. Meanwhile, Alex Condon will be the 4, and Ruben Chinyelu, who is now up to 271 pounds, will be the 5. Micah Handlogden, who Florida staff views as a starting caliber big man after being in and out of the lineup with a leg injury 2 years ago, is in a situation where he should be in pre-injury form. But I'll say this. My big takeaways from those players after watching them in practice, the way that both Condon and Hauck are shooting the basketball. There is tangible progress, at least in practice, for the shooting ability of Condon and Hauck. And this team is going to need more offense that it got last year out of its front court, because the backcourt with Clayton, Martin, and obviously Aberdeen and Richard was the driving force in this run to a national championship. Now, anytime you're talking about trying to go back-to-back and win a national championship, it's an interesting dynamic, because the quest for this Florida team to win a national championship is vastly different and totally different than Billy Donovan's Florida teams that won the national championship in 06 and 07. What do I mean by that? Those Florida teams under Billy Donovan brought back the entire squad that won the title in 2006. For the 06-07 season. Torian Green, Lee Humphrey, Corey Brewer, Joakim Noah, Al Horford, and a couple of reserves as well in Walter Hodge and Chris Richard. For this Florida team, you have your core 4 guys back up front. Hauck, Condon, Ruben Chinyelu, and also Micah Handlogden. But other than that, it is a brand new perimeter for Todd Golden in Florida. There's been a lot of attention on Xavion Lee, the transfer from Princeton. There's been a lot of attention on Boogie Fland, and for good reason. But I'm telling you, after watching this team practice, it reiterates why there is so much attention always on players that are coming in, especially in this era, via the transfer portal. It needs to be celebrated more what is retained and what's returning, especially when you're talking about a team that won a national championship last year. I don't think, and I've been now close to 30 schools, I've seen a front court in America that's close to being as deep as Florida's. And I consider Tommy Hauck a front court player, even though he's going to slide down and start at small forward for this basketball team. The front court for Florida has all the requisites to be in a situation where you can see, for all intents and purposes, a team that will be in a scenario where it will again be at the top of the SEC. But I will say this. there was a sleeper at the highest level in Florida's practice. And he's not really a sleeper because he's a highly touted freshman. But sometimes freshmen with all these transfers get swept under the rug a little bit. Sometimes freshmen are in a situation where they don't get the same attention as people out of the portal. I was really impressed with CJ Ingram at Florida's practice. 6'6", built with an incredible physique. Looks like the type of player that could be Florida's 6th or 7th man in 25-26. So that's the 4-1-1 from Florida. Now, the second thing, in terms of looking at three big things for this week's show, Kansas has its lowest external expectations ever under Bill Self. Now, you might remember, I did a show over the summer, and I talked ad nauseum about the idea that Kansas, if we're going by returning personnel, was in a situation where it was going to be projected and should be projected as the 6th best team in the Big 12. Because look at what the other teams in this conference had returning from last year. Houston has 3 starters back, Emmanuel Sharp, Milos Uzan, and also Joseph Tugler, from a team that lost to Florida in the national championship game. Meanwhile, BYU brings back 2 starters, Richie Saunders and Keba Keita, from a team that we have to remember went to the Sweet 16 and lost to Alabama. You want to go a little bit further? We'll go a little bit further. Texas Tech has the Big 12 Player of the Year in JT Toppin coming back, along with Christian Anderson, who carried Texas Tech offensively in the Sweet 16 to come back and beat Arkansas. Iowa State, Tamin Lipsey's back, even though he's injured right now. Milan Momcilovic is back. Joshua Jefferson is back. And Arizona brings back 4 players from a roster that went to the Sweet 16. Toby Awaka, Jaden Bradley, Anthony Del Orso, and Mo Krevish, who missed last year with an injury, but is a starting caliber big. So those 5 programs, and I said this over the summer, all brought significantly more back than Kansas did. And Kansas was a team that didn't win a game in the NCAA tournament. People thought I was crazy when I said, based on returning personnel, that Kansas should have been viewed as the 6th best team in the Big 12. Kansas was picked 6th in the Big 12 preseason poll this week. And now you have to start looking at the fact that Kansas has its lowest external expectations ever under Bill Self. That doesn't mean that Kansas can't usurp those expectations. I'm going to go to Lawrence on Tuesday. I'm going to see this team practice. I'm going to see it all unfold in front of me, at least for a couple hours. And I'm trying to think, and I've been trying to think for the last couple of days, has there ever been a time since I've been doing this where the expectations were this low under Bill Self? A little bit before the 11-12 season, after Kansas lost the Morris twins, and then Thomas Robinson and Tyshawn Taylor came to the forefront. If you remember, Thomas Robinson went on to have an unbelievable season, and Kansas went all the way that year to the national championship game where it lost to Kentucky. But with that said, we've got a scenario now where Kansas, who in Big 12 regular season games over the last 2 years is 21-17, is in a situation where it has its lowest external expectations under Bill Self. We'll see if it changes. There is always optimism when you are talking to coaches. Remember this now, early in the season. Players and coaches are always optimistic. Now, again, this is part of the reason why I'm going to practice. Just how good is Darren Peterson? Just how much of a jump is Flory Badunga going to make? How good is Trey White, who was good at USC, played on obviously a bad team at Louisville, and was very good for Illinois, but how much of an impact can he make? It doesn't feel like, and I've been saying it for months, but it doesn't feel like this is anywhere close to a vintage Kansas team. Now, with that said, Darren Peterson is somebody you expect to have an All-American type season. Darren Peterson is somebody who is very much in the discussion to be the number 1 overall pick in the 2006 NBA draft, along with AJ DeBanza and along with Cam Boozer. But again, as I've talked about on this show multiple times, just because you are somebody that is projected to be a high pick in that upcoming year's NBA draft, that does not mean, for all intents and purposes, that you are going to be in a scenario where you are, let's just call it what it is, where you are in position to lead a team to great heights in college basketball. How would we view this roster if it wasn't Kansas and if it wasn't coached by Bill Self? It's what I've been saying for a couple of months. And we are going to get Kansas, obviously, against high-level teams really, really quickly out of the gate. You are going to get Kansas in the Champions Classic. You are going to get Kansas against UConn at Allen Fieldhouse. You are going to get Kansas, obviously, in the Players era. You are going to get Kansas against Missouri. You are going to get Kansas on the road on December 13th against NC State. The curtain is going to come up for the Jayhawks well before Big 12 play. But the facts are the facts. I said it over the summer, Kansas should be viewed as the sixth best team in the Big 12. And according to many other people, not just me, that's where the Jayhawks were viewed going to this season. But you know as well as I do, this is only October. Now, I went on Saturday to St. John's exhibition game against Towson at Carnesecca Arena. I also went to the St. John's practice that I had talked about last week, the Saturday prior to that. And I think we can say without hesitation that St. John's defense is ahead of its offense. Now, this to me is a major, major surprise because the 4-1-1 on last year's St. John's team that won 31 games in both the Big East regular season and tournament titles was obviously that of a great defensive team, one that competed exceptionally hard, but had major offensive limitations. And when you looked at the roster that was put together by Rick Pitino, the major thought was that this team would be exponentially better offensively and the defense would have to catch up. And after watching St. John's in a practice and after watching St. John's against CAA favorite Towson on Saturday at Carnesecca Arena, I can say without hesitation that the defense for this team is well ahead of its offense. Now, let's look at that for the St. John's fan right now, who I know wanted to, jump off the Queensboro Bridge when they were down by 8 at the half against Towson as a positive. Because being courtside for that game, I saw very, very quickly that this has a chance to be a better defensive team than a lot of people thought. I said this after I went to St. John's practice 2 weeks ago. Dylan Mitchell was going to have and is going to have an incredible impact on this team because he does not need the ball to be successful. And when Rick Pitino put Dylan Mitchell into the game in the second half against Towson on Saturday, I know it was an exhibition game, but it was still an opportunity to take inventory. Everything changed. He went on the top of the press. He stifled Towson. It was a very, very good mid-major team under Pat Scarry, but it still is going to take some time for St. John's. And I know it's only October. It's going to take some time for this sauce to percolate a bit on the stove. Now, what do I mean by that? St. John's, and I don't think this is obviously much to be debated, is going to have one of the best power forward center combinations in college basketball with Bryce Hopkins and with Zuby Ejiofor. I don't think that's a debate. Hopkins was St. John's best player on Saturday against Towson. Ejiofor did not have one of his best games. But Hopkins, again, when he was at Providence, when he was healthy, he was a 16-9 guy. I'm going to throw a little teaser out there. We are going to do All-Americans, my preseason All-Americans, next week here on Inside College Basketball Now. Those two players, Bryce Hopkins and Zuby Ejiofor, will be a part of that discussion. Now, with that said, even though you have the positives that you have Bryce Hopkins and Zuby Ejiofor, which is as good of a 4-5 combination as you're going to have in the sport, and even though you have a scenario where you have, obviously, a team that's ahead of schedule defensively, there are still major things that need to be ironed out for St. John's from an offensive perspective. And I said it when I went to the practice 2 weeks ago, and I'm going to say the same thing after watching this team in an exhibition game. Things are disjointed offensively for St. John's. There are kinks that need to be worked out. Now, it's only October. You have gifted offensive players on this roster. Ian Jackson, transferred from North Carolina. Joe Zonsanen, transferred from Arizona State. Osiah Sellers, transferred from Stanford. These are individually gifted offensive players that have proven throughout their college career that they're capable of scoring the basketball. But the biggest takeaway that I saw is the rhythm and the flow offensively is not where it needs to be. And this is a team, and we've heard Rick Pitino talk about this throughout the preseason, that does not have a vintage table setter to set the table on offense. Last year's team had 3 guys who could play the point. Davon Smith, Kadari Richmond, and also, of course, Simeon Wilcher, who's now at Texas. This team does not have that. Now, Rick Pitino has talked about, playing with positionless basketball with whoever has the ball as the push man. We're going to see a little bit more how that works on Saturday night against Michigan at Madison Square Garden. Dusty May brings in a top 10-ish caliber team for an exhibition game. And even though these exhibition games, again, do not count, they don't mean anything, and I'm going to get to more of my observations later in the show, but you take inventory from this stuff. And the inventory I've taken when it comes to St. John's is this: after one game against the team in Towson that, if it wins the CAA, could be a 13, 14, or 15 seed in the NCAA tournament. St. John's defense is well ahead of its offense, and it looks like defensively it has the chance, and this is not a surprise because Rick Pitino's the head coach, it looks like it has a chance again to be elite defensively. Dylan Mitchell needs to be on the floor for St. John's because I don't know if he's a great scorer, and I don't think he'll ever be a great scorer. But he has the incredible ability to affect this team without demanding shots. And I think if you look at it from the coach's perspective, the number one thing, or at least one of the number one things you're thinking about when you look at St. John's roster, is shot distribution and whose hands the ball's in. I don't think you have to worry about that at all when Dylan Mitchell's on the court because he's doing all the intangible things that make up winning. And the third observation that's sticking out when it comes to St. John's, there is major, major things that need to be worked out offensively. Hopkins and Ejiofor are going to be as good of a combo as you have up front. But the perimeter still is clay that needs to be molded. And we're going to get another opportunity just to see that perimeter against a much higher level of competition, with all due respect to Towson, who, again, is the favorite in the CAA. Because Michigan's coming in with Elliot Cadeau, with Roddy Gale, with Namari Burnett, with, obviously, LJ Kaysen, and with a front line with a potential All-American in Yaxel Lendeborg, and if healthy, Morez Johnson and Adai Mara. Morez Johnson and Adai Mara did not play in the exhibition game that Michigan had last week against Cincinnati. So all those variables will be on display for St. John's coming up on Saturday night at Madison Square Garden. Want to get your thoughts on what I just discussed. Want to make sure that you are in the chat right now, giving me your thoughts on those topics or anything else that is going to really get you excited for the college basketball season that is just 14 days away. Jon Rothstein here on Inside College Basketball Now.
When you need your sports news all the time,
we've got breaking news to bring to you.
CBS Sports HQ gives you a snapshot of all the sports that matter to you. When you need your sports in a snap, find it on CBS Sports HQ. Streaming free anywhere you are.
Jon Rothstein back here on Inside College Basketball Now. I want to remind you to subscribe to Inside College Basketball Now on Apple Podcasts. We want to be your Bible for the college basketball season and beyond. We are the only college basketball podcast coming to you 52 weeks out of the calendar year. I want you to also like and subscribe to make sure that you are giving us everything you've got in the chat, and also send me your questions. Right now, I'm going to get to everything here in the chat. Our first question goes from Bring Back Urban as John, how big is the gap right now between Florida and Kentucky? Well, I'll tell you, I think that there's really good depth this year in the SEC, but I do not really feel like we have seen a team separate itself yet in the SEC. I think when you look at the top half of that league, or even beyond the top half of that league, Florida, Kentucky, Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, Auburn, Texas, Ole Miss. I think if you look at the teams that are picked 6, 7, 8, and you flip them later in the year with the teams that are picked 3, 4, 5, I don't think that many people would be surprised. Okay, wants to know, John, what are your expectations for Keyshawn Hall, Tahad Pettiford, and Auburn this year? Well, if you heard last week, we had an interview with Stephen Pearl, and if you didn't hear it, please go check it out on Apple or Spotify. But look, I expect Auburn, and I know it's a big, big transition to go from one of the great coaches we had in the sport in Bruce Pearl to somebody in Stephen Pearl that has never coached a game yet. But I expect Auburn to be an NCAA tournament team in 2026. I think those are fair expectations for the Tigers. Zero Dark Rogan says, John, so since Wally said, this is Wally Zerbiak, Duke would have been the greatest team of all time if they won the Natty, can we now normalize Florida as that toughest SEC ever? They win the tourney, toughest path of all time to a Natty, GOAT team, 2025 Gators. I'm not going to say that. Now, I did not agree with Wally when he made that point, and I remember the show that you're referencing, but I will say this, Florida isn't even the best national champion in the last 2 years. That would go to UConn. BK says you're going to see a stud tomorrow in Lawrence and see a young man named Cole Rosario. The hype is big with him. Look, Cole Rosario has obviously gotten rave reviews on social media. He's obviously somebody who was highly touted in the recruiting world and so on and so forth. But I am somebody who has always taken a wait and see approach when I have evaluated players making the transition. Always done that. And now I look at Cole Rosario the same way I look at other freshmen. I'm sure there will be moments of promise. I'm sure there will be moments of hope and some really good shot making. But until you see it, it is very difficult to depend on. And especially in this climate, you just don't know how these freshmen are going to respond when they get minutes and also when they're competing against for minutes and also against in competition players in a lot of cases that are bigger, stronger, faster, and older. Bring back Urban again is very, very chatty today. He says, what mid-major teams should we be paying attention to this season? Well, obviously Gonzaga and St. Mary's, even though Gonzaga isn't really a mid-major program out of the West Coast Conference. Also, San Diego State out of the Mountain West. San Diego State lost to UCLA in an exhibition, but I would say those are obviously some ones right off the top of my head. Other ones I really like is a team, Towson, that I saw against St. John's in that exhibition game. But there's a number of mid-majors across the country that obviously I'm very, very high on. San Francisco out of the West Coast Conference, another team that's really interesting. Ashley Quinlan, 8335, says, John, do you think Isaiah Sellers can assume the ball handling duties for St. John's? It seems like it's not going to be Ian Jackson. Well, that's how St. John's started on Saturday with Isaiah Sellers, Joe Zonsanen, and Ian Jackson. Nothing is in sync right now in terms of St. John's perimeter. It's an ongoing process. And again, it was just one exhibition game. But St. John's, to its credit, and this goes back to the point I was making earlier in the show, its defense was able to will it to a big-time lead on Saturday against Towson. It was 29-21 Towson at the half. And then St. John's went on a 40-15 run, and it was 61-44. But Rick Pitino late in the game put Dylan Darling into the game, the backup point guard from Idaho State, and St. John's was not able to handle the pressure of Towson in that end-of-game situation and was in a scenario where it found itself struggling to close out Towson after building a 17-point lead. I'm really interested to see where St. John's comes out or how St. John's comes out Saturday night against Michigan at Madison Square Garden. We will get a couple of nuggets in to put a bow on this show when we return. Jon Rothstein here on Inside College Basketball Now.
Only CBS Sports can bring you big time during the heart of Saturday afternoons. It's big time.
It's big time. It's big time. It's big time.
On CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
All right, Jon Rothstein back here on Inside College Basketball Now. Time to put a cap on this show with three good nuggets. And the first one, I'm going to go into exhibition games because I want to say this and I want to be clear. Exhibition games do mean nothing but you are able to take inventory throughout many, many programs in college basketball by watching, by learning personnel, by noticing trends. Now, this stood out to me. Nebraska, a team that was picked 14th in the Big Ten preseason poll, played an exhibition game against BYU, who was ranked 8th in the AP Top 25 on Saturday and was able to win the game. Now, I know that Rob Wright, BYU's point guard, did not play in the second half, but just the fact that Nebraska was able to win that game reiterated to me that Pinnacle Bank Arena might be, again, a tough out for teams in the Big Ten this season. The most impressive exhibition result I saw, because it was a true road win, was UCLA's trip to San Diego State. UCLA got up big in that game and closed out San Diego State. UCLA did not have Eric Daly. San Diego State did not have Magoon Guath. But for UCLA to go on the road in a true road environment and win that game without maybe its second or third best player in Eric Daly was a big time sign of a team that I've been saying all offseason should be exponentially better with New Mexico transfer Donovan Dent at point guard. Was also encouraged by the way Cincinnati played at Michigan. Michigan, as I mentioned, was without Adai Mara and also Morez Johnson. Sean Abayev, the talented freshman for Cincinnati, was sensational. And again, Wes Miller has had promise of certain people early in the season before, so you don't want to get too excited. But Cincinnati also has a very, very advantageous early season schedule. Cincinnati won't play a game out of its city limits, I believe, till December, because Cincinnati is going to have a home game against Dayton, a crosstown shootout game at Xavier, which is across town. And Cincinnati's also going to play Louisville, which is obviously a very difficult game, but it's going to be playing them at Heritage Bank Center or Heritage Bank Arena in downtown Cincinnati. That's an advantageous schedule for Wes Miller to get off to a good start. That game in downtown Cincinnati is a great opportunity against Louisville. UConn played BC without Silas Demery Jr. and also without Taris Reed. So they're starting point guard, they're starting center, and destroyed BC, who, again, I picked 18th out of 18, or excuse me, I picked 17th out of 18 teams in the ACC. But UConn, to me, looked like it was significantly deeper than last year's team. I also think Jalen Stewart could be one of these guys that emerges into the conversation among the best potential substitutes in college basketball. Creighton also beat Iowa State last Friday. No Jackson McAndrew, no Owen Freeman. Liked what I saw from Charlotte transfer Nick Graves for Greg McDermott and the Blue Jays. Now, nugget number 2, the unsung Wildcat. I'm talking about Alabama transfer Mohamed Diabate. I broke out the fine-tooth comb, and I went over the numbers of when Mohamed Diabate played 20 minutes or more last season for Alabama. His averages, 13.3 points, 10.4 rebounds, and 1.6 blocks. This guy is going to be a fan favorite at Rupp Arena for Kentucky by Thanksgiving. And the third and final nugget, trying to break the streak. These teams that I'm going to list here are teams that are trying to break the streak of missing the NCAA tournament, because there's been a number of NCAA tournament droughts for a long time for these programs. We're just going to throw the graphic up here and look at these programs who are trying to break the streak. Butler, who last went in 2018, Cincinnati in 2019, Florida State in 2021, Georgetown in 2021, Ohio State in 2022. Then on the right side of your screen, you got Stanford in 2014, Syracuse 2021, UNLV in 2013, Villanova in 2022. That last Villanova appearance was Jay Wright's last season as head coach. And then Washington 2019. If you're asking me who are the most likely schools to break the drought this year on this list, I would go, and this is in order, Ohio State, Washington, Cincinnati, Georgetown, Syracuse. That's my 2 cents on that for today. Want to remind you to subscribe to Inside College Basketball Now on both Apple and Spotify. Again, we want to be your Bible for the college basketball season and beyond. We are the only college basketball podcast coming to you 52 weeks out of the calendar year. I am back on the road this week. Again, I'm going to Kansas practice on Tuesday. I'm going to stop by Big 12 Media Day on Wednesday. And Thursday, I'm going to be at Mountain West Media Day. So a little crisscross before we continue here, getting you set for the start of the 25-26 college basketball season, which again begins 2 weeks from today. I'm Jon Rothstein, and this was Inside College Basketball Now.